supposed to start?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I guess this is going to be kind of informal, so
Yeah.
I guess I'll just talk a little bit about kind of the start of the press and then how Kim and I came to work together. It actually, the process started with a reading series I hosted here called the Final Thursday Reading Series, and it got the name because it's done on the final Thursday of the month. It's in its 12th year now. The first 8 had been at a sadly departed coffee house near the UNI campus in Cedar Falls. We bought it in a bookstore, bought again books. Been there for 8 years, and then the last 4 years, when that closed down, it's been at the Hearst Center for the Arts, which is much swankier digs than the second floor of the coffee house was. And the format of this series is a featured reader, preceded by an open mic. It's been run for this whole 12 years with officially zero money, and I find ways to get a little bit of money here and there. It draws anywhere between kind of 20 and 70 people a month. And Final Thursday Press was an outgrowth of that, a related project in that it also focuses on regional writers, much less ambitious than what Tim does. Because the press that I have publishes, we published a half dozen books of poetry every couple of years, maybe, which is not a lot, but which I found to be a kind of sustainable. Because what happens, the way this works, is a kind of micro press, I guess you would call it, is that it's run on the model of publishing a book, going completely broke, and then clawing my way back to have enough money to be able to kind of do the next book. And as long as I can keep doing that when it's a not-for-profit organization, so I can do that. Then it becomes possible. And actually, that means I'm not trying to do too much either. I couldn't if I wanted to, because I wouldn't have enough money. So it supports itself on book sales. So I did get 1 grant for book once. I guess just in my kind of selection process is pretty random. In that I don't really accept unsolicited manuscripts. I'm not really out looking, but just because of the reading series and because of people I know, I'll find someone whose poetry I like and be able to say, well, could this be a book? And sometimes that's people that I've read at the reading series. There's featured readers. Sometimes just people have come up at the open mic. And actually, the situation with Kim was a little bit like that, though. Kim had a literature course with me way back in the day. I hadn't actually read your poetry. And then one summer, I did a kind of poetry contest through the site, giving away books for poems that were with 8 lines or less was the kind of way that the contest was defined. And Kim submitted this great poem, easily the best one that was submitted, but I was not the judge, someone else was, and the judge didn't choose it. Which is one of those great injustices in life that would often goes unaddressed, but I was actually able to address it by then getting the ball rolling with Kim and talk about the idea. Well, would it be possible to do a collection, a kind of chapbook? And it turned out that was something Kim was wanting to do, had been thinking about wanting to put together a collection as well, so it just turned out that the timing worked out. In lots of cases, that's how it is, just that the situation works out. I guess to just say a little bit about working with poetry as an editor, and I would say once it becomes known that you publish poetry, you will never be lonely for friends, because we're always poets, because that's always poets. It's just hard to find an outlet because it's very difficult for collections to actually make money. Again, that's one of the reasons why it's nice for me to be a not-for-profit, because it's already built in. I'm not going to be making money on it. And I feel like working with, and I actually teach fiction writing over at UNI. And I'm pretty, I think, assertive in the kind of suggestions that I will make for fiction writers. I tend to give, working as an editor though, I tend to give poetry writers a little bit more leeway. I'm reluctant to make, I think, kind of big thematic suggestions usually. What actually drives a lot of the decision making is actually what I think of as the tyranny of the page. Because the collections are either a 32-page chapbook or a 48-page perfect bound edition. And I want to be able to use all available space, but without the collection feeling crowded. So there will be lots of back and forth of, well, what if we get rid of this poem? I like it, but this one does something like this other poem in the collection, and that's where we'll have a lot of the discussions. Except when it comes to punctuation, I'm really tough on punctuation, which none of the poets I've worked with have been happy about. But it's my principle that unless there's a formal reason for unconventional punctuation, that it really should be standard usage that applies. Standard usage of commas and periods. You're good. Okay. And I'm pretty insistent on that because in my mind, I often have to teach these collections with first-year college students, and I really do feel that it actually helps to make things more clear for students, particularly who might be a little intimidated by picking up a collection to read. And I guess I'll just say one of the benefits of working with the regional authors is that I actually get to talk to them. I guess I know that sounds silly, but so much is done by email and I still do, and we still do a lot in that way. But there's moments where we actually have to sit down and look at things together, and that does make a difference. I love the moment when Kim did this, and a couple other people I've worked with has. There's a moment when I get the word for it, I should know this, but the kind of test copy that they run at the printers comes out, and they have to come and sign off on it before they'll do the whole run. And I usually have the author come over for that, and it's like going to visit the baby at the nursery, and you're kind of looking over all the features, hoping that everything's going well, and it's those kind of moments you wouldn't get to do if I had just had work with someone, I don't know, California or something like that.
Yeah, can I interrupt you?
Yeah,
Just say a moment about a thing about that moment. I think you had left me a message, and I was in class or something, and I got out, and I was like, oh my gosh, and I called you, and you didn't answer right away, and I called you again, and you answered, and you were eating dinner, and I was like, can I please come over right now? And it was like okay, I'll wait 40 minutes. Okay. So yeah, it's a really nice. I mean, to be able to go over to the publisher's house and see the product, and so yeah. In the same time, it's nice.
I guess I can stop there too. I have some things to say about electronic publishing. That's probably for kind of later on in the conversation. Did you?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm waiting for another publisher to just come send me a note that says, hey, I'd like to talk to you, because I sure got lucky with getting this publication, getting this book out with Final Thursday Press. And I had written, Jim Carrey said he wrote that note that said, I'm going to make $1 million, and stuck it in his pocket when he was nobody, and next thing, and I was like, I'm doing that. So I wrote a note, and it said, published 10 poems in journals this year, published collection next year, and it was literally like 2 weeks later that Jim emailed me and said, I'd like to talk to you, stop by my office sometime when you have a few minutes. And I was like, he probably wants to publish a book in my poetry, because I knew he was but I was joking, I was kidding. So when I showed up and he's like, oh, I wanted to talk to you about doing a collection, I was like, shut up. So I don't think it usually happens that way, and I know I got really lucky this time, and it's probably going to be a lot more work next time sending out manuscripts, and I was just at the point of thinking I had enough pieces that I would want to put a collection together. So I was a very lucky person. And then a word about punctuation too, and capital letters and things like that. Us poets supposedly choose all those things very carefully, and I stand by that. I think that is true. I think that I do. One contention, and when I got my book out, I wanted to see if we had a white blank page in there, because I was thinking, do we or do we not? And I think probably as a publisher, it's really hard not to put something there. But if you can't have a little breath. Jim was talking a little bit about the puzzle of getting it fit together. But I remember one poem that I had that was about falling asleep, and I felt like on the page everything was getting smaller and smaller. One of the last lines had the word lifesaver in it, cherry lifesaver. And so yes, the candy, but I didn't want to capitalize that L because things were getting smaller at that point. And with that big fat L in there, and I remember, I think Jim said, correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a couple years now, but I think he said, well, I'm the publisher, so I'm going to have the final say on this. And, but he was also very gracious about other things where I'm like, I did that for a reason, and here's the reason, and, he may not like that reason so much, but would allow the poem to be what it was. And also your edits and suggestions for the poems were always so gracious. So I think I got so lucky in more than one way to be able to publish with Final Thursday Press.
Even though you lost the battle with the lifesaver.
I lost the battle with the lifesaver. Yeah, at least we didn't have
I think there was like 3 email messages back and forth.
Yeah, let's please not capitalize. Let's please capitalize. One little letter. At least we didn't have to put a little T in there. Because they you always see that in like the writers' magazines, or, I don't really look at those, like Writer's Digest, they'll say like, don't use Kleenex as a lowercase noun, and so I think, unless you want to, unless it works in the poem that way, so I guess I'm a little irreverent, but then I would need someone like to rein me a little bit, so.
How did that work with the number of poems that you had? Did you have a lot more poems that could fit in the format, or did you have to weed out, or did you have the collection pretty much the way it went into the book?
Well, I didn't have, there were quite a few that got removed as we worked and, fitted into the space. And I'm okay with that. I'm not super prolific. I don't write 100 poems a year. So I was okay with, cutting it down to the strongest pieces. And I didn't have an order even in mind when I first, and when we talked, he said, give me he'd heard a couple of my poems that I read at Final Thursday readings or other readings that he's very supportive about coming to a lot of the readings in town. And so there wasn't really an order, and here's a whole slew of things. And I think when we finally started getting them in order, I remember one email from you said, well, the way we have it now is so much more positive. And I think it was the way that, which poems, the content of which poems and how they played out with each other. So once, at first I wasn't even thinking of that at all. It was just like, well, here's 32 poems that are ready for a permanent home. So there were extras. I don't know how many ended up in here. We probably cut maybe 10 or so from the original manuscript.
But you're right, that was noticeable, and that's something I find happening when I will teach a whole collection as opposed to, many people just will you teach a poem or two by someone, but with the whole collection, there is a kind of narrative to the collection as a whole, and then particularly with this collection, the order of the poems went and changed that narrative, which I thought was really interesting.
How did you find, Kim, did you find that it changed your relationship with your own work to know that it was going to be sort of finished in that way, and made public, that it was going to be this sort of tangible, finished product that really means you're done, it's over now, and there's some way you have to let it go now, right? You can no longer change it, right?
Well, I think you could, and in fact, I had one issue of the North American Review that my first issue that I did, we don't usually publish our editors, but I was in the first issue that I was editing, as that's their tradition. And when that piece came out, speaking of nonfiction, there's a whole paragraph, and every copy that I gave to somebody, I'm like, cross out all the lines in that paragraph because I don't but it's scary to call something finished. And then, especially when, a couple, maybe 3 months go by of the editing and publishing process, and then you have that, and you're like, and you slowly open it, and let's face it, if you've published enough things, there's a little bit of fear right there where it's like, okay, now it's print, there's a lot of copies.
And there's always one typo or error, no matter how many people proofread. You just
Mhm.
come to accept it, though it drives me crazy. We try not to let it happen, but always.
But you're kind of forced now that it's published, you're sort of forced to look at it through the eyes of anyone who happens to be holding it, right?
Yeah, and I actually love doing that. If I get an email from someone and they're like, I just picked up your book and read it, I'll be like, oh, and I'll pick it up and read it again and imagine I'm them, and I'm just like, oh, what would they think of all this, and read it with you. So I do that. That's probably not a great thing to do, but yeah, good. Thanks for anything.
I was just wondering, Tim, you were talking about the things you might change or think about changing. Since you have this prolonged process, do you ever go back? I guess you have to explain kind of what you're doing, but do you ever have to go back, or Doug, in submitting stuff, did you ever find that, okay, so it went in like this, 3 months later, you're at this point in printing it. I'll let you guys talk, but that process of going back and forth or redoing things must even be harder than the case with the Myotype machine.
I'll find out. I just handed him some galley proofs.
No.
And here's an interesting, I haven't looked at the galleys yet, but there may have to be change depending on when the thing is actually published, because in the opening paragraphs make reference to the fact that Iowa has 5 congressional districts. After November, it will have 4. So,
Thanksgiving. I think we're in.
okay.
Lifesaver, uppercase or lowercase.
Yeah.
Yeah, my latest go around with that has been, with my proofreader has been, should J.C. Penney be capital J, capital C, capital P? In their ads, it's all
Yeah, now
lowercase.
it's lowercase.
And I went through that with a reviewer last year. She just insisted it be capital, you know. Said, no, in the ads, it's all lowercase. So the editor won.
Well, if you're getting product placement, isn't it in the product?
Yeah, where's your J.C. Penney ad? In the Wapsipinicon Almanac.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear about editing writing relationship, a one-on-one deal, because with each issue, I probably deal with 30 writers and reviewers and artists, and so I can't give the attention to each individual. I kind of envy you there, unless you're dealing with somebody who's really a problem, then, you know.
I'll stay silent on that one.
Wasn't you, Kim?
Wasn't
I
good.
was
No,
gonna
no,
say,
no.
we'll talk about that.
Yeah, you two seem to still be talking. I've had just almost 100% favorable dealings with my contributors over the years. I just can't really complain. And I am at the process right now, in the stage where I'm soliciting manuscripts and calling people to see if they'd have something to contribute, or I'm going through material people have sent me now. Because I publish once a year my collection of fiction and essays and reviews. And I still set this copy on a linotype machine, if anybody knows what that is. I print via letterpress. And so I'm sort of half an editor and half of a printer, and sort of a distributor. And I spend a lot of my time setting type, designing ads, selling ads, binding, gluing on covers, things like that. So I'm probably what you'd call a half-time editor. And whether anybody can be both a printer and an editor is up for debate, but I've tried, and things seem to be working out. I started my almanac in 1988. I'd been a printer for, probably 13 years or something like that, doing local job work. And I'd always wanted to produce some kind of a magazine like the Almanac. And first I had to learn what I was doing in the print shop, because you don't just run a 9-ton press and walk into it. But that took a while, and it took me a while to get to know more of the writers and the artists in my area. And fortunately, I'm centrally located between Dubuque and Iowa City and the Quad Cities and Fayette. And so I had a nice area to work with. And it was a little difficult at the beginning because I was just a few years out of the University of Montana. I'd come back to Iowa. I was living in Anamosa, near Anamosa on the family farm, and I didn't really know a lot of people in that area. It took a while, and I sent out a form letter early on to people who I thought might be interested, and the response was good. And it took a few years before more people knew about the Almanac, and since my job has become much easier because people now have heard of what I'm doing. And I came out with that first issue in the spring of 1988, a long time ago, and have pretty much kept the same format and sold about the same number of ads, and I guess my circulation's up a little bit, although I don't really have subscriptions. I just keep a mailing list. But still editing, still printing, still looking for good material, and something's going right because I'm still around after how many years. But I'm very pleased to be able to still do this, and I'm just always delighted to find so many good writers in this part of the world, and from surrounding states. The more people I publish from Wisconsin or Illinois or Missouri or Nebraska or Minnesota, I tend to think of myself as more of a regional publication, but it's mostly Iowa, I have to say. And I don't really have any formal presentation. I'm certainly open to any questions, or, let's just keep it moving.
Are you at least able to charge more for your ads now than in 1988?
Not much more. I do try to run ads from small independent, maybe out of the way businesses, more artistic. When I started out, it was more of the potters, the fiber people, the paper makers, natural food co-op type things, and I guess the natural food thing's still going strong, but a lot of the independent artisans have gone to work somewhere else. But I try to keep the advertisers small, home-based type businesses, or organizations or foundations that interest me, and they seem to still be out there. And when you have a whole state to draw from, that helps too.
So how did you first meet Doug, or how do you know he wrote, or did he give you something unsolicited?
That's a good question, because I think I've published, 4 of your essays?
Something like that.
Or one 4 Seasons mini almanac, and about to publish another. You must have got a hold of me.
That's an interesting story, because what happened was that a friend and colleague of mine from Upper Iowa still belongs to a group of people from eastern Iowa who get together once a month and talk about literature and read stuff to each other. And she had taken a piece I had written to one of these gatherings, sort of a social gathering as much as anything.
Is that the one-room country school?
I believe so, yeah. And she read it, and one of her compadres at this meeting said, "Oh, there's this guy Tim Fay who I bet would like to see that. You should have your friend who wrote this get in touch with him." So I sent it off to Tim, and kind of segues into, I had seen and had read, like one copy of the Wapsipinicon Almanac up until that time. I wasn't really familiar with it. And it was fortunate that, when my friend was reading this piece, someone else who heard it was familiar with the kind of thing that Tim printed, because lesson number one, and sometimes it's a hard one to learn, is if you want to publish with a particular editor, a particular journal, what have you, read the damn thing, So often people don't. And I recall, I learned this, it was really kind of like a slap in the face at the time, a well-deserved slap in the face, when I was a young instructor of English at East Carolina University, just trying to get my name in print wherever I could. And I didn't know, I'll write anything. And I happened to be pretty successful at getting wildflowers dug up in the woods, which you can't even probably do anymore, to grow in my garden at home. And I thought, I can do this. I think I'll write something about this. And I wrote a piece about how to get wildflowers to acclimate from their home in the woods to your own garden at home. And it was actually pretty well written. I got a copy of the Writer's Market, and I sent it off to, I don't know what the publication was, but then by and by I got a letter back from the editor that said, essentially, it's an interesting piece. Probably if you had read my book on this subject, you wouldn't have needed to write. But that was, I was just glad the person did it by mail. It didn't say, you idiot, read what I've already written before you try to sell it to me. But I thought, you really should be familiar with the kind of thing that this publisher does publish before you start. And you probably get fewer poetry submissions of people, or maybe, well, you said once it got out that you publish poetry, you no longer lacked for friends.
No, I will get random collections from, you know, Azerbaijan or something. You know, there's like all kinds of things that pop up. Yeah.
So you sent it to Tim then?
Yes.
And then what kind of process did you go through? To get-
Those were the days when you mailed it.
Yeah, you mailed it in,
Mhm.
and then after 3 months, then you found the envelope, opened it, and responded to him?
When would that have been? Early 90s maybe?
Yeah. Really
So,
good.
so in that process, is there much back and forth, or is it, okay, this is the piece and it's going in like that?
There's not much back and forth with Tim. You send something and you know he's got it, and eventually he'll respond. And I mean, something with the almanac, you know, he does one a year,
Yeah.
and so there doesn't seem to be that sense of urgency. Maybe it feels different from his perspective. But I think once.
You live in a small town, I know where to find you.
Yeah, exactly.
You all know the Stephen Bloom controversy.
The fiction versus nonfiction kind of?
No, well, you know who Stephen Bloom is, the guy who wrote the piece about Iowa before the caucus,
Yeah. I
published it in Atlantic Online. Jim, you and I talked about it.
That guy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
The guy who'd probably be shot on sight now
Oh.
if he weren't in Michigan on sabbatical. He found one years ago at a Walmart, an almanac, and he just called me on the phone. This guy is a journalism professor at the university. And then that's how he found it. And in those days, I think I may have gone with some kind of national distributor that put him in places like that. I don't do that anymore, but, you know, distribution's a whole nother angle that we can talk about if anybody's interested. But yeah, this guy just called me on the phone. Then I published a few of his pieces years ago.
So would you have published this one?
It was a terrible essay. It wasn't, I mean, there were some really interesting points, and he was right on a lot of things, but there were enough inaccuracies that it just came off as being silly.
I spent like a week explaining, because to explain to everyone, I know that, no, I don't really agree with that. Even though I'm not a person from Iowa, that's not how I feel.
I heard an interesting story the other day, and I hope everybody knows the piece we're talking about. It was in all the newspapers. There were op-eds. A guy who wrote a book with this Mr. Bloom had an op-ed in the Cedar Rapids paper saying he's not my friend anymore.
Oh, no.
The guy came out and really put it to Iowa. And
Is he a journalism?
I
journalism.
wrote a book on Postville.
He wrote the book on Postville and the Jewish thing up there, the slaughterhouse. And, but this was a huge controversy. I mean,
In Iowa. I
In
don't think
Iowa.
it was anywhere else.
anyway, big mess.
Kim, I was wondering, because Kim's up with the other hat she wears is as the nonfiction editor at the North American Review, and that is a whole different kind of schedule that you're doing. There used to be 6, now 4 issues a year. And I wonder how the flow of that all goes. I mean, because with what I'm doing, what Tim does, there's a process, and when it's done, it's kind of done for a while, but it's never done over it.
No, it isn't. In fact, we recently went to electronic submissions over there, and so we also take paper still, but mostly our submissions are coming in electronically. And my goal over break was to read all the submissions to catch up with nonfiction. And it's online and it grows daily. You can look at the, you go to the end on page 8, I'm like, no, stop submitting for 5 minutes, I have to catch up with you. So, yeah, we're never.
Could I ask, when you send out a rejection, do you have a form, or do you actually write something to each contributor?
Now that we are doing it electronically, it's a lot easier to write to the contributors, and I do that when I feel like I have something to say to them. In fact, this is what I thought you were going to say about your essay and not reading the publication first. I recently got a nonfiction submission that was like 42-page manuscript with footnotes. And like the North American Review isn't capable of, even publishing a 42-page manuscript. That would be our whole issue. And I wrote to the person, I said, this is not at all a fit for the North American Review, and please, before you submit again, pick up a copy of the magazine so you know what you're submitting to. Yeah, so, that definitely is an issue for us too.
If someone does send a 42-page with, do you even bother to read it, or do you say?
Oh, heavens no.
Okay.
No way.
If it doesn't fit your.
No, one of the first things I look at is the page count in the upper right-hand corner, and if it's over 25 pages, I don't read it. I mean, I don't mean to be rude to those writers and not give them what they deserve, because they do deserve to be read. But if I know already that it's not fit, that it's going to be way too long, or, if you read 2 pages and you know that the writing style or the writing isn't strong enough or the style is not a fit, yeah, I don't bother to read the rest.
I volunteered as a fiction reader at the NAR for a little while, and that was, and it's funny how that all works, because, you walk in and this was all paper, so there was like, this stack that had to be gone through. So you really your job is really not to read. In a way, I mean, you do, you want to give everything a chance, but you really want to try to get through the stack. So it's true that you really are looking, so I actually felt good when I could see, like, I got through the first paragraph and saw some, like, outrageous usage error, and I would be like, okay, I was actually like, oh good, this one I can just kind of skim because it's already so bad, yeah. So I came to realize, and I tell my fiction writers this, that first paragraph really makes a huge difference if you're trying to get out of the slush pile. Because you've got to create a story that's some way the person who's trying not to read your work will nevertheless be compelled to read it. Which is nothing like when we teach writing in a school location, right? Where you're going to get a fair hearing and people are going to take your work seriously. No, that's not going to happen in a lot of places. I get a lot of submissions.
Kim, are you able to run things past somebody else to get their opinion?
Yep, I am actually the third person to read. We have 2 students go through all of it, at least for nonfiction, we have 2 students for each piece, and then they leave comments and they leave a vote, a yes or no vote, or a maybe if they're not sure. And so then, yeah.
Must be nice.
And sometimes, I know. Well, and then the poetry people, it's even nicer because they will narrow it down to like 50 possible poems and then have a meeting. Everybody will talk with them, about and argue, and they're like, no, I like this poem because, and maybe poetry is more subjective, so you kind of have to champion them a little bit more. I mean, you can tell when a piece of prose is well written or not well written. And then the other questions are, is the topic interesting? Does it fit? Is it, all the other things? But poetry is so much more subjective. So.
About what is the proportion of nonfiction to fiction submissions for the review, and has that changed over time?
I would say that we are getting more and more nonfiction than each year. I've been there, I think, 4 years now, and I would say the nonfiction submissions have grown every single year. We're still not getting quite as much as fiction does. Nonfiction too, it comes from everywhere. I mean, certain people consider themselves, we were talking about this on the way up, but certain people consider themselves fiction writers, that's what they do, but everybody, feels like they should take a stab at nonfiction, and they should. Maybe not necessarily publishing it, but I'll get cover letters that say, my family thought I should try to get this published somewhere, and I'm like, that's like a red flag right off the bat, Okay, my mom read this, and she said I should send it to you.
Sounds like one of those American Idol auditions. Francis, and I said,
Yeah.
Now, when you get the letter that said, my mom just hated this, that's why I'm sending it. Then you might check it out.
I recently got a cover letter that said, this was rejected by, and they named the magazine, I don't remember who it was, but they said they wished they had the balls to print it. And I was like, oh, interesting. And so then I was like, I didn't want to finish reading the cover letter. I was like, I wonder what this piece is about. We didn't end up taking it either.
Isn't that false?
And it wasn't because we didn't, yeah. I didn't want to say that word once.
I'd like to ask a little bit about the sort of medium of these. I mean, Tim, you're working with a letterpress, and Jim, I know you have done some work with ebooks and electronic publishing. I mean, I'd like to hear some about the sort of the difference in these presentations and how it affects maybe audience and the work itself.
Well, he's still saying,
I told Tim that if he could just figure out a way to make his own paper, he could make it his task impossible in a year.
That when the apocalypse hits.
Yeah.
Raise the soybeans for the ink.
Well, I'm actually trying to figure out what to do in terms of electronic publishing. I've actually done most of the work to put together a free Kindle edition, a kind of best of Final Thursday Press. But I've found, well, a combination, the formatting, just to get it right, has been very tricky. And there's just no way to find out. And so like, there's not like good resources just for you'd think that Kindle, Kindle stuff would have something like that. So anyways, it makes sense, I think, one way it makes sense to have for me, to do a kind of electronic edition. I mean, that'd be much easier to distribute than actually to be selling print editions from Amazon, where if I can just not lose money, because it takes such a huge chunk of everything, I'd be happy. But the problem, it's a tricky thing for me, because the printer I work with, this is what it kind of all comes down to, gives me a good rate for 500 copies of an edition. So that's my standard run. If I tried to do a run of only 250 copies, because there would be an electronic edition, it would only be about $100 cheaper. So it's not worth it for me not to do this big run of 500. But then I go back and forth, I'm like, do people really want to read poetry on an e-reader? I mean, I think there are certain things that make sense. I've read the whole Girl with the Dragon Tattoo trilogy on my iPod, right? I mean, so I think for me, they have a kind of place. But poetry on e-readers doesn't seem to have be as good of a fit.
Does the formatting stay, I mean, can they do the formatting? I mean, obviously they can do that, I guess.
It's particularly hard for poetry because of line breaks.
Mhm.
And I haven't even, in different size screens, like you lose control of a lot of that stuff you can control in print. So it's less of an issue, I think, if I was doing fiction, but with poetry, I haven't found a good solution. And then I guess I'll just note that in back, if you want, on the way up, if you want to just check it out, there's an ebook app that I had done for a children's book, which actually started as a print booklet, and I wasn't seriously trying to publish it. I was just giving it to people who send it to friends and families when they have babies, and then it wound up in the hands, or actually on the floor of somebody who was interested in doing some type of iPad application, and kind of took it up. And so I didn't do the programming, but I did have a kind of say in kind of the look and feel of it. And the way it's set up is that it's designed for infants, and that it's all black and white and images, the kind of way that they do some of these mobiles now. But it's a touch screen, and you can move the graphics and manipulate them in a way that toddlers completely get. So when I've done readings at libraries, I'll explain how the book works, and immediately they'll be like, "I get it. Shut up. Let me do it." And say it over. So for me, I mean, there's a place for all these things. So I'm just trying to figure out what is the right place to put in your time where it makes sense. For me, that's a challenge.
And Tim, with your, I know David was asking about that in the process as well, but in terms of the length of the pieces that go into the Wapsipinicon, is there a length you say, okay, it has to be between this and this?
no, not really.
And so have you had pieces that were really long? Did that mean that, how did that work for you?
I just take pieces as long as I think they need to be effective, and I make fit what I can fit, and maybe hold something for the next year, or just work it out that way. I have 160 pages, pretty
That's right.
pages to fill. That's a lot of stuff, and so it usually works out.
I think I always say though that you're kind of unique in being able to do that, not feeling that there have to be like certain things that are the same every issue necessarily, that you really do kind of like, some issues will have really long pieces, others won't, depending on what you get.
Probably the longest piece that I've ever published would be about 12 pages in the almanac, and I get about 750 words to a page. Things are typed, no graphics, they're just plain lines.
Wow.
And who is the audience of what Adrian was saying? Does it make a difference? Like, do you think it would change if you, like, you have a mailing list, so do you have any sense of who your audience is? Like, who's on your mailing list? Are they all over the country? Are they just in Iowa?
Well, I sell a lot of these in Iowa, of course, and I do have a mailing list. I don't have subscriptions since I'm the only person doing this. I don't want to have a subscription list if something happens to me, and so I just distribute out of my car, drive around. That's one thing I like about this. I get to see a lot of Iowa and actually go meet
So
people.
you have some with you?
Yeah, in my car.
Okay.
But I just trying to distribute the almanac. Of course, I come out about Thanksgiving, and that's usually when everything hits the fan with the weather in Iowa. But I get around.
How did you
you
time
know.
that one?
And it's nice to, I like Iowa. I like the small towns, and I hit all the little libraries, and it's just kind of a routine.
And then in the mailing list, are they people from farther?
Yeah, all over. Yeah, California, East Coast.
And then how do they learn about it?
Well, I've been very lucky with, ever heard of the Utney Reader? Anybody? They did a thing on the almanac in the early 90s, and I had a lot of inquiries from all over. Some of those people have stuck around, and I've noticed people will send the almanac as a Christmas gift or something to somebody, one of their kids who's in Oregon, or a friend of theirs who grew up on a farm in Iowa who's now living in Alabama or something. Some of them will stick around, so just a little bit of everything.
And you have a set number of them that you print? Or do you print based on how many there are on the mailing
No,
list?
I've been doing probably between 1,500 and 1,800 every year for the last few years. And they pretty much disappear.
So you said you're in galleys now.
Well, I'm just starting to, I've got 3 essays set now.
So that's like you do galleys for one essay and then send it out.
Then I put it together in pages, figure out some kind of design, maybe tie up some artwork with it, and choose a typeface for the display lines. And one thing I've started doing in the last few years that has changed, I think maybe that piece you'll read from later, the Four Seasons Mini Almanac, which was, is that 2 years ago?
Yeah.
I go through the galleys, I check for errors, I give them to my proofreader, she checks for errors, then I make those corrections. Then I send them to the actual writer, which is something I didn't really used to do. And I think it's really, because an extra set of eyes is always good. There's, like you said, there's always something that seeps through. And writers, I think, understand that with my typesetting process, to change 3 words in a sentence can necessitate me resetting a whole column. So I think people are pretty good about that. And most folks don't seem to want to change their minds too much after they've sent me their final thing. So, although I just gave him a couple of galleys, who knows well.
Mark Twain was apparently very, very good. Of course, he spent most of his life as a printer, and so he was very good at, when he became a successful author, at making corrections in the galleys that he was sent that included the exact same number of spaces that the error had made. So, because he knew what those guys were going through.
I'm setting in a mechanical keyboard, melting hot lead. In those days, they set every letter by hand.
Could you, speaking of that, could you talk a little bit about just simply the mechanics of
Sure.
putting together something like that?
Well, everything I print is what you call letterpress printing. It's very simple. If you take a batch of typewriter keys and put them together and ink those, and then the paper hits it, that's what letterpress printing is. Everything's raised to the same height, whether it be an illustration, a photo, line of wood type, line of handset type, or text set on the linotype. It's all the same height. And it's pretty simple. You've got different kinds of presses, and rollers go over and ink that type high material. Paper hits it, either rolls over it or smacks it like that, and it's printed. It's pretty much like little linoleum blocks you may have done in art class in 7th grade.
So you have all the individual letters that you then put in a tray or something?
Yeah, although they're usually not individual letters. That's the way they would have done it in Mark Twain's day. Although he did lose a fortune trying to put money into a typesetting machine. And that was an interesting part of his career. He lost his shirt on that big, and he went on a worldwide speaking tour, and that was the only way he saved himself. And of course, did real well after that. But most of the type in the linotype in the almanac is set on a linotype machine, which was invented after Mark Twain lost his shirt. Would have been the 1880s. And what happens is that I sit at a keyboard, and I've got lowercase letters on the left side, punctuation and numbers in the middle, and then caps on the right. So it's a whole different fingering process from a typewriter. And I hit a key, and a little brass mold comes down into an assembling unit, and then I get a line of these matrices, these brass matrices that have these molds, and I hit a lever, and they go through, and I've got a pot of hot lead that shoots hot lead through a mouthpiece into these little molds, and because this lead mixture cools immediately, I just get what's called a slug with raised letters. I'll just picture all those raised typewriter keys. And then the brass molds are automatically carried back to what we call a magazine, and there are little tiny nicks on each brass mold, and they fall down into different channels. And I don't know if I mentioned this at Cedar Falls when I talked, but one designer, educator guy described the linotype machine as a cross between a typewriter and a backhoe and a pop machine. And it's, linotype operation was a whole trade in itself. I mean, in fact, there was a linotype school in Charles City, Iowa, until the late 60s. And it was the trade, there was a strong union that went along with it. But of course, when photo typesetting came along and offset printing, linotypes just got pushed into the landfill, scrapped. But I think something was really lost there, and I hung on with it. And one reason I got into letterpress printing was because all this stuff was available. This was the mid-1970s, and all this material was just being scrapped. But a lot of the people who owned the stuff and were forced to scrap it were delighted to see that somebody was willing to take this stuff and actually use it. But that's the romantic part of it. The reality is that you've got a machine with, probably 1,200 moving parts, and it's a challenge. All kinds of belts and gears, and there's maintenance, and a linotype squirting hot lead is not what you call user-friendly.
Do you have to take any precautions? I mean, I guess hot lead is one thing, but just lead itself, I mean, is there any
Well, I handle a lot of lead, but my understanding is you're okay unless you get around boiling lead. Something about the fumes that take off from that will, do your brain cells no good.
Probably don't eat it either.
I don't eat it.
Try to avoid that.
I try to keep good ventilation, and I always use common sense and wash my hands before I eat anything. I mean, there are a lot of things in the print shop that solvents and ink fumes, and historically printers drank a lot and they all smoked, and they didn't last very long. We're in a different era now. But I don't know how much you're aware of this, but this whole letterpress printing thing on a smaller scale from what I'm doing has really taken off among young people, because design students, for instance, who've been raised with nothing but digital their whole life, keyboards and all that, maybe in an art class or something, get exposed to actually hand setting type and taking a nice sheet of paper and printing a wood block or a line of hand set type, maybe doing a broadside or a chapbook of poetry, are just fascinated with it. And so this stuff isn't getting junked anymore, which is kind of neat.
Tim, I don't know if you've met Don McCollum, but he teaches.
We met in the late '80s. I've been to
Okay.
Tim's shop, but Dave Hicks brought me up to your place
Oh, that was a
a
long
long time ago. I actually thought, I was thinking it was the middle '80s, so I was shocked when you said you'd only started in '88. It must have been around '89, '90. And, yeah, for those of you who don't know, I did my master's with the Center of the Book at Iowa City, studied Kim and Kay, and did my master's thesis on here in Duncan.
You teach here now?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
But we don't do that stuff.
Yeah.
I gotta finish the Mark Twain story,
Oh,
because it does, I don't know, say it has a happy ending, and nobody knows whether this is actually true, but Twain did say that after this whole, whatever, he wasn't a line, his printing fiasco where he lost his shirt and had to take the world tour lecturing to make his money back, he said that he did learn his lesson as a result of all that. And so when a young man named Alexander Graham Bell came knocking on the door trying to get him to invest in this invention called the telephone, he told him where to get off.
He had a telephone. He bought a telephone, but he could never imagine, who the hell
Anybody
you
else?
call besides other doctors and lawyers and
Oh, yeah,
and-
right.
and wealthy
So
people.
funny.
Yeah, Mark Twain as a young man printed in Keokuk, Iowa. Yeah. Of course, Walt Whitman started out as a printer too. That was his career.
Does anybody have any questions, Jody? Any guys have any questions?
I want to know how big your signatures are, how many pages or sides you get off a signature when you print it. And the question, the real question being, do you work the seasons into a signature? I've never counted the pages to know whether the length of the sections is arbitrary, or if you try not to avoid splitting work between the signature.
Well, for the insides of the almanac, I print on a 20-inch by 26-inch sheet, and there'll be 8 pages on a side, and then flip it over, print the other 8. So it'd be a 16-page signature. And then I do 10 of those for a 160-page book.
And do you try, I know when I do that kind of stuff, I try really hard not to split a piece of work between 2 signatures, because that's really,
What
It can get confusing.
when you're saying signature?
oh, if each print's on a sheet, that's a signature.
This-
So
the
it's
sheet
8 up,
itself
it's
is
8
a
up,
signature?
it's folded, cut into 16 pages.
When it's
Yeah.
folded down, then it's called a signature.
Okay.
Because this 20 by 26 sheet, I fold 3 times with the sheet, and then, ends up 16 pages. But there's a whole science, which was just a trade in itself in the printing industry, called imposition, where you want to make sure that you don't open a book and there's page 73 and then there's page 156. You've got to get those pages all in the right order. So everything I do as I lay out pages is done from a dummy. It's got, when you open up that 16-page signature, it's got each page numbered. And then I check it and recheck it, because the last thing you want to do is go to print the other side of a sheet, and it's like, 1 in the morning, oops. It's a real bad feeling.
Plus you must print these months apart, right? You don't, or you maintain all the type so you can come back and reprint it.
I do all the printing in November.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
I thought maybe you set a section, printed that signature, then.
Because I need to know, I've
That's
got
a lot
enough
of
for
lead.
everything. Yeah, I just melted down the last almanac, after I printed everything, I melt it down, usually this time of year. And I think the last, I did 2,800 pounds of lead.
Wow.
Is Eldon still with you?
Eldon is still there, but he's 86 now. This is a guy who's been with me years doing typesetting. He learned it in the deaf school. He's a deaf mute linotype operator. Wonderful guy. But, 86, he's not moving as fast as he used to. So I'm doing most of the typesetting now.
On your website, there's a picture of them.
In the late 40s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jody and Mary, do you guys have any questions? Jody's in the library, they're both in the library. So. Do you seal publishers or distributors, you know, do people come by? Are there a lot of local publications that come by and try to get their stuff at the library or?
Occasionally, I think Becky takes care of that.
Tim, I don't know if you do any, do you try to do any like electronic, I know it's not, you don't do electronic editions, but as far as the distribution, I'm trying to remember if, Almanac's available, Barnes and Noble or Amazon or anything like that, or is that?
No.
It's just no, I mean, for me, I mean, I do that, though, it's, like I said, it's like, all I can do is just go to Raheem, but simply then, I know that anybody can order the book anywhere. So that's, that's kind of an advantage for that, but it's an awful way to try to.
How do you distribute your books?
Well, I mean, they're available on Amazon, and then a lot of it's just.
So each runs 500 pretty
Yeah.
much?
Yeah. So I don't have a good system, I mean, it's easy,
I'm
much
sure
easier.
that the writer gets a certain number.
Right,
and all that.
right, but I never felt like I had like the distribution system down. And for poetry, it's a lot different, because people don't tend to wander into a bookstore and just pick up a book of poetry based on the cover. I mean, the way that they might with a book. So it's really, it always feels like it's like one copy at a time. I mean, I know it's always that way, but it really feels like that when you're selling poetry. It's
Do you
one
send
copy.
out review copies?
I will do some, but I haven't found that's been like a great way of selling books.
Do you send out review copies?
If you were to hook up with Barnes and Noble or some national chain of bookstores, wouldn't you have to be printing like 100,000 copies?
Well, in the last, 10 years, Borders, remember the Borders chain? 4 of them in Iowa. They were always very easy to deal with. You go in, I knew each Borders manager, and I would go in and deal directly with Borders. Barnes and Noble, you could never do that. They just said, go away. And in the last few years, maybe the last 4 years, Borders came out with a new policy that regional or independent publishers had to go through a distributor to get into your store. So, okay. Does anybody want to hear this story?
Wow.
Okay. So, they suggested this outfit in Florida called Source Interlink. Doesn't rhyme with Wapsipinicon Almanac, but anyway, I figured, well, as long as I'm going to have to do this, I'll see if I can get into the Barnes and Noble stores. Because when you're talking about distribution, take Cedar Rapids, for instance. The Barnes and Noble's the only game in town. There's not another bookstore. There's no independent anywhere. So I went through all the channels, went through everything, and I'm dealing with this corporation in Florida, this Source Interlink. And it's really a very, very cumbersome, frustrating process to deal with a distributor when you're used to driving around a friendly place like Iowa with your product in your car, and you get to know each, like the people at Prairie Lights in Iowa City, the people at River Lights in Dubuque, all these really small-scale operations, the New Pioneer Co-op in Iowa City, people I've been dealing with for years. Suddenly, I'm emailing people in Florida, and the terms are anything but favorable. I mean, they get half the cover price. Their method of doing business, they want me to ship my big batch of magazines to some warehouse in Pennsylvania. I pay for that. Then they want to charge me to ship them back to the stores, and then they take half the cover price. And I'm just thinking, this does not pencil out. I said, how about if I just deliver to the stores in Iowa myself, because I'm going to these towns anyway. Well, okay. So worked that out, and another painful aspect of that whole situation is that anything that doesn't sell in their stores, and keep in mind, this is a very hand-produced publication, covers glued on by hand, they take and they shred it.
That's right.
That's painful,
Yeah.
but that's what you go through to get in to deal with where people buy books now. So that's just part of life. But the Borders stores are done,
Yeah.
and they've been replaced in 3 Iowa locations by this Books A Million chain. I don't know if any of you have ever been in one of those on the street is that they possibly will just deal with people directly, so I'm looking into that. Distribution is just, how can I, well, let's just say it's troublesome. Dealing with the big boys. I love getting around dealing with the small names. And the librarians are great. Hit these little towns and seeing the same librarians year after year. It's kind of fun.
Where is Elma? Is she in one? Where's the library though? What, for Parveen?
Yeah.
She was a student here, she just graduated and became a librarian director of the library in a small town like Elma. But I don't know which town exactly.
A lot of towns like Elma out there.
Yes.
Small town libraries are really great. I mean, sometimes, I had one interesting encounter. It was a little town not far, it was in Jones County where I'm from. There was this little town called Wyoming on Highway 64, about 15 miles from Anamosa, and I walked in there one day with my latest issue, and you're interested in my latest almanac, and the librarian was a kind of a young woman, very pregnant, probably about 30, and she says, "I'd love to buy your almanac, but the fact is, people in this town who check out books are old ladies who want to read Gothic romances, and I just don't think your magazine would fly." Okay, have a nice day.